Some big-name witnesses taking the stand at the Skelos corruption trial today. That as the prosecution continues to make its case against the former Senate Majority Leader and his son, Adam. Dominic Carter, he's live in Lower Manhattan. Busy day down there, right, Dom?
Oh, you could say that again, Richard. Senator Al D'Amato, the former longtime senator of New York State, Richard, he says that he was not, emphasize, not testifying against his longtime friend today, Dean Skelos, who happens to be a fellow Republican who was also from Long Island. Al D'Amato says, Richard, he was only answering questions. With photographers standing by, there was drama in courtroom 18B of this federal courthouse, with major Republican power broker, former Senator Al D'Amato, taking the stand. The evidence is building, and it surely does not help either Skelos with what D'Amato had to say. In surprise testimony, D'Amato said that Adam Skelos tried to get a job at his lobbying firm but was turned down. The appearance of impropriety was such that we could not work with him, D'Amato said on the stand. As the prosecution's case is winding down, D'Amato added the contact was set up by Dean Skelos. But that wasn't all. D'Amato testified that he told the former Senate Majority Leader in a telephone conversation in April of 2013 that things were not working out for his son at company PRI. Quote, there was difficulty in that Adam was not showing up for work, and when he did, he was disruptive. Dean and Adam Skelos say they are innocent. Mr. Skelos, how do you feel about the case?
I'm not going to comment on the case.
She will have a lot to say to us as soon as this is all over. I want to show you something, Richard, from just a couple of minutes ago. Some video of Adam Skelos, the man at the center of all of this, the son of the Skelos family, walking away from court just a few minutes ago. I believe that's his wife that was with him. As it relates to Adam Skelos, it was announced by his lawyer today, Richard, they will not call any defense witnesses as it relates to Adam Skelos. As it relates to Dean Skelos, the former Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Skelos' lawyer said they will take the weekend to decide whether or not they will put on any prosecution witnesses. There is no court. Kimber Wood, the federal judge here, no court on Monday, Richard. Judge Wood announced they'll be in conferences as it relates to the charge to the jury. As you have reported night after night, Richard, it is that charge that's extremely important as it relates to the jury. Now, Richard, I want to conclude on this note. The U.S. Attorney, Mr. Barrera himself, guess what? Right before Al D'Amato took the stand, guess who walked into the courtroom? The U.S. Attorney himself, who got the prosecution on 7 counts against Sheldon Silver just on Monday. The U.S. Attorney walked in himself, and minutes after Al D'Amato was off the stand, guess who left the courtroom? The U.S. Attorney. So, Richard, very interesting developments taking place today. Let's go back to you.
Wouldn't you say the consensus of the folks you spoke to down there is if Silver got convicted on all 7 counts that he was looking at with the evidence presented, given the wiretaps that have been played in court and the damning testimony we've heard about the Skeloses and let alone the pressures that some of the folks at the center of this field that were being exerted on them to basically funnel work here to Adam, that it looks like it's really bad here for the Skelos father and son team going into what looks to be the final week of the trial.
Richard, in the process of trying to be objective, let me just put it to you this way. It looks really, really bad. One has to wonder why they even went to trial. And, I've heard some lawyers say that you don't really have the option of plea bargaining and so on, but we know that they do. Why didn't they just plea bargain? Because it's really bad. And, Richard, I'm glad you brought that up because 20 minutes before court ended, I mean, the prosecution is just piling on. They called a lobbyist that is a very damaging witness against Adam Skelos. So it's not looking good. And Richard, guess what? It's not over. The prosecution continues Monday. They're going to wrap on Monday, but it's almost like they're just like hitting grand slams over the wall. There's no other way to put it, Richard. That's what's happening in this courtroom right behind us, Richard.
All right, Dominic, thank you very much here. And where Dominic came from, literally right across in Foley Square from where the Silver trial was held. And the conviction in that case is renewing calls to finally deal with ethics reform in the Capitol. Now, earlier today, I spoke with Associate Fordham law professor as well as gubernatorial candidate Zephyr Teachout about her plan to just do that, reform Albany. You know, I read your op-ed piece, which I thought was interesting. I wanted to get to it in a second. But first, I'm curious on Monday if you were surprised as well with the verdict that came back. There was always a lot of skepticism that they didn't prove the quid pro quo, or in many ways the worst thing, that what he did was actually illegal, though distasteful. Were you surprised he wasn't just guilty, but guilty on all 7 counts?
I have to admit I was, and I knew they had the facts, and I know the law fairly well, so I knew that they were covered on the legal front. But it's really hard being a New Yorker to not be surprised seeing Silver get convicted. You sort of have this feeling like at the last minute he's going to figure something out. I think it's a big deal, though, because as you point out, they did have to prove a quid pro quo, but they didn't have to prove an explicit quid pro quo. In other words, they had to prove a deal, but not that anybody ever wrote out a contract or had a conversation where they said, you give me this, I'll give you that. And it's a really big deal that he was convicted on a non-explicit quid pro quo, because honestly, that's what happens all the time in Albany.
Well, speaking of Albany, as people remember from your campaign, you're banging the drum on reform. And I'll ask you to answer a question that you spoke about in the piece you recently penned, and that is, what is the legacy of Sheldon Silver? And also attendant to that, what is the cost of corruption?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think is really important is to look at how much Silver concentrated power and led to this current 3 men in a room where, unfortunately, we have not only a corrupt culture in Albany, but a culture where everybody is silent all the time. You know, you don't see a lot of lawmakers speaking up against those in power, whether that be Andrew Cuomo or Shelley Silver. And Silver really concentrated power. That's one problem, and made it very secretive, the process in Albany. The real cost is that really starting in about 2009, it's more recent, he started really working for big downstate New York City luxury developers. And in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars from them, he did a whole bunch of things that have really changed the landscape of New York City. One is encourage a tax break for luxury developers, which has really raised the cost of living for most city residents. And another is he was actually really instrumental in keeping this quote-unquote balance of power, but really unfair system where there's Republican control in the Senate and Democratic control in the House. And what that means is that all of the Democratic priorities that most of the state has, we can't push through because the Republican Senate blocks it. And Silver, along with Andrew Cuomo, was instrumental in making sure that Republicans still had that power.
Well, to that end, it's funny because I've spoken to a lot of legislators, both in the Assembly and Senate, and I said, all right, in the aftermath of Silver, why should the public think we're not going to just rearrange the deck chairs and it'll be any different this time? And I pushed the issue of a full-time legislature, and the majority of them are saying, you can't really do that, it won't work. But I know this will be hard for the public to stomach, but if we're willing to pay them more, isn't that the fastest and cleanest way to make sure there's no conflicts of interest?
The fastest and cleanest way, I think, is, well, there's a few things I think are important. One is we got to stop having a private financing of elections model. Because although Silver was convicted for the illegal money he took, he was clearly working for his donors as well, his campaign donors. And we've got to shift to a public financing model like we have here in the city. The second is, I think I agree with you. I think you can't serve two masters. I think we should have cap on outside income, possibly a full-time legislature. You can't be working for your constituents without being influenced by the fact that you're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from somebody on the outside. And actually, most lawmakers wouldn't be affected by a cap on outside income. So when lawmakers tell you there is no appetite or it wouldn't work, they're just saying they don't want change. Now, of course they don't want change, but we as the public want change. So I don't have a lot of confidence that if we sort of leave Albany alone, they're going to look at the Silver trial and say, oh, now everything's different. I do have a lot of confidence that the public in New York is going to look at the Silver trial and say, hey, if you're my representative, you've got to do a lot more than just lip service.
Obviously, you and the governor have not seen eye to eye on more than a few things. That said, nobody's going to dispute here that he's shrewd and he knows how to play the game in Albany. To that end, he does not have a better window of time, I don't believe, than now if he wants to get reform through, because I don't care what party you're from. You stand in the way of whatever reforms he's going to go through, you're not going to look like a heel back to your constituents, but he hasn't shown an interest in really doing that. He's flip-flopped on the full-time legislature idea. Even taking cynicism into account, why wouldn't he want to do this, especially if he campaigned on it 5 years ago?
You're saying exactly what I would say if I could speak to him, is say, 2010, you ran as the anti-corruption governor. You have a moment right now like you will never have to say, we are really going to do something, and let's put everything else aside until we reform ourselves. And, he's has very, very little credibility as an anti-corruption fighter now after shutting down the Moreland Commission about questions about his own role in meddling with the Moreland Commission. I will tell you, if he decided to say, I'm going to take this moment, he would see people around the state, including me, just cheering and supporting him as being a reform leader. If he wants a legacy in New York State, this is a moment for that. And I hope he's really thinking about taking leadership here.
Coming up next, I'm going to bring in the guys here, and we're going to talk about what is next for Albany as it deals with yet another rash of bad press on the subject of corruption. What will, if anything, this governor do? Stay with us.